Hi there, and welcome to another episode of Immigration Law Made Easy. I'm your host, Attorney Hillary Walsh, and in today's episode, I'm excited to talk to you about the difference between an immigration bond hearing and requesting parole from ICE. This is something that I have done for hundreds and hundreds of clients, both bond hearings and requests for parole. And honestly, it's still confusing for baby attorneys, new attorneys who I have helped kind of navigate this process. And it's definitely confusing and very stressful to not know the difference and not really understand the difference for the family member and for the immigrant who is detained. So in this podcast episode, I'm going to break it down for you so you can really understand the difference between the two and kind of what the expected outcome is for each one and what the timeline is for each one as well. So let's jump right into it. First of all, what's a bond hearing? A bond hearing, and I have a whole episode on this as well if you want to look at the Immigration Law Made Easy podcast on what the difference is between a bond hearing and a master calendar hearing. But let's talk about just in this episode, what is a bond hearing? A bond hearing's purpose is for a judge, an immigration judge, to decide whether or not to set a certain bond amount, a dollar amount, that would justify allowing your family member to be released from the detention center or not. So the key thing here to really focus on is it's a judge who makes the decision, and it's about dollars. You got to pay to get out of the detention center, essentially. And sometimes they'll say that no amount, you can pay $100,000 and be able to get out of the detention center. And that's an immigration judge's decision. And it's going to be in court with a hearing. There will be a translator provided and all of that. Now, there are some factors that an immigration judge is going to consider. And the main things are going to be, and I should say that the judge is going to consider in deciding whether or not to let your family member out of the detention center. The main things that the judge is going to consider are whether there's criminal history, whether your family member has ties to the community, whether they have family ties. Maybe they're married to a U.S. citizen or their parents are lawful permanent residents, and whether the detained immigrant has employment history. Because if you have a lot of steady employment, this can actually be a really good sign for immigration purposes. And the judges consider all of these things when deciding whether your family member poses a danger to the community and whether or not he or she is a flight risk. And those are kind of the big focuses for a judge in deciding, well, if she's not dangerous and she's not going to take off, she's going to keep coming back to court, then I should set a low bond amount and allow her to be out of the detention center while her case is pending. Now, when you are in a bond hearing, there is a beginning, middle, and end, and the end is your outcome. The outcome is either you're granted a bond, which means the judge is saying, I will allow you to leave the detention center if you pay this certain dollar amount. Maybe it's $5,000. Maybe it's $1,800. I've had some cases where it's $25,000 is what the immigration judge said the person had to pay in order to be released from the detention center. If, however, the judge decides that I'm not going to grant a bond, then the request for being allowed to leave is denied, and the immigrant has to stay in custody, and the immigration case continues. The important thing, again, is when we think about bond hearings, is that they're all about assessing the risk and making sure that the individual will continue to go to court if they were released. These hearings are done by a judge, and they're going to talk about things like whether or not you're allowed to, pay a certain amount to be able to get out of the detention center. A key thing to keep in mind here is that you're basically granted only one, you're never guaranteed. It's not always a right to have a bond hearing. In some cases, judges actually have no jurisdiction. They have no permission that legally allows them to grant a bond. But in cases where they can say, yes, I do have jurisdiction, I am legally allowed to grant you a bond, they'll make that decision, but they'll usually only make that decision once. That's why it's so important that when you go in for a bond hearing, you're prepared, you're ready, you have everything that you could possibly want. And sometimes as immigration lawyers, we get into the hearing and we realize, wow, I'm learning things because the Department of Homeland Security, the government attorney, is providing evidence, maybe of criminal history or other things that have happened that I didn't know about before. And so I want to basically push pause and I want to come back later, because you can shoot your shot basically one time in immigration court for a bond hearing. After that, it is like really climbing uphill. It's very, very difficult to get another bond hearing and to get granted bond if you've been denied bond before. So that's why at my firm, at New Frontier Immigration Law, we focus so strongly on really being prepared and shooting that shot once the right way when we're doing our immigration bond hearings with the immigration judge. Okay, so now let's talk about what is an ICE parole. What is parole? Parole is something that ICE does. It's like the people who are inside the detention center, the security guys. When you think about for a bond hearing, it's an immigration judge. So think about the black robe. That's a judge that's going to decide whether your family member can get out of the detention center. For a parole request, think about someone in a security or like a police uniform. It's an ICE officer usually who's going to decide if your family member can leave or not. And one of the key differences here is the focus really isn't on whether they're a danger to the community or whether they're a flight risk, although those things are important. For ICE, the main focus is there a humanitarian reason or a significant public interest for why the person should be released? So they're kind of like a different inquiry, although we end up submitting a lot of similar evidence. Now, where an immigration judge, they have to have jurisdiction to be able to grant a bond. Basically, they have to have a law that says you're allowed to decide whether or not you can let this person out of the detention center. For ICE, there's no really statutory basis. There's no legislative basis where they can say, I don't have jurisdiction to or not to release this person from the detention center, because they're doing it for a humanitarian reason, right? So if they're looking at it, they're saying there are significant humanitarian reasons. There's a great public interest, like the community would be better if this person were out of the detention center. Those are all great things, and ICE would be able to release your family member. Another key difference is where an immigration judge, you really only have one opportunity. How I'm saying you shoot your one shot. This is your one chance to do this. With an ICE parole, you can request it multiple times, although in my experience, usually the first decision is the final decision, even though you can request over and over. You can request it repeatedly. Finally, a key difference between the two types of processes is with a bond hearing, the judge is going to tell you have to pay a certain amount of money in order to be released, right? I talked about $5,000 or, oh my gosh, all the way up to $25,000. And I've even heard of cases where someone was told they had to pay upwards of $100,000 in order to be released. And that was here in Arizona. It was not one of my cases, but I have heard of it. It was actually former immigration judge Davis. Okay, by contrast, in a parole request, no money is involved. You don't have to pay anything to ICE in order to be released. And so those are the two main differences when it comes to a bond hearing versus an ICE release on parole. Timing is also something that's important to take into consideration. With a bond hearing, when we, as your lawyer, when we request a bond hearing, the immigration court is required to set the bond hearing in a certain number of days. Most cases, you're going to see the bond hearing set within 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, but most of the time it's going to be 2 weeks or even sooner. Okay. They have to get you that bond hearing if it's allowed to be set. If the judge has jurisdiction, it's supposed to be set within a certain amount of time. And we see between 2 and 3 weeks, if not sooner. By contrast, with an ICE parole request, there are no rules. This is a humanitarian, this is a discretionary thing. They get to make up the rules. They get to adjudicate it or decide whether or not to grant parole on their timeline. And so there really is no pushing them or forcing them to make a decision any faster than you just kind of are at their mercy. I've seen it take 2 or 3 months for them to answer a parole request, and I've seen it take 2 or 3 hours. There are no rules when it comes to parole requests. And so as you go through this process and you hire for bond and parole or one or the other, it's important to know what the expectations are and what, as attorneys, we have the power to do. Because the immigration judge has rules from, Congress setting when you're supposed to get these hearings done. It's a lot easier to see the predictability of when you're going to have a bond hearing. By contrast, is very unpredictable with a parole request. And we really are at the mercy of just saying, will you please let this person out? And you, as a lawyer, don't usually really want to threaten the same person that you're wanting to do you a favor and help your client out by releasing them. And so we as attorneys kind of have to walk a fine line on exactly how we want to navigate this process. Now, in the end, as we kind of come to a conclusion here on today's podcast episode, I hope that you can see what the differences are between these two processes, that you see not only for an immigration judge, for a bond hearing, that it's with a judge, it's talking about money in exchange for being released, and it's also focusing on the danger to the community and the flight risk that the individual who's detained may or may not pose. By contrast, with a parole request, it's with an ICE officer, so someone that's like in a police uniform, like a security guard type uniform. There's no money exchanged, and it really is a focus on things like humanitarian reasons, public interest reasons, with a small glimpse and a smaller look and emphasis on whether that person is a flight risk or a danger to the community. The other big difference is expectations on a resolution. You have one chance, essentially. There are exceptions to the rule, but in my experience, you should be very, very, very mindful of your one shot with your immigration judge on a bond hearing, and you should never go in and hope that you can get another hearing later, because those are never guaranteed. And you would expect from the time you hire New Frontier Immigration Law to hopefully having a resolution and answer on whether your family member can get out or not, I would expect for that to be within about a month, right? Because if you hire us and then we file everything and we go from there, then you're going to then have about 2 to 3 weeks for the judge to set the hearing. And then at the hearing, we present the case, and God willing, they're released soon after that, because we were able to get them a bond. Of course, that's not guaranteed. That's just what our hope is for the outcome. By contrast, with an ICE parole request, it can be all over the place. And sometimes they don't even contact us to tell us that they have granted the parole. You instead will get a phone call from your family member saying, come pick me up, they're releasing me, which is always, one way or the other, we want your family member out of that detention center. Tune in for more episodes on Immigration Law Made Easy. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be your lawyer. Thank you so much for the opportunity, if I'm not your lawyer, to be your teacher. And I wish you all the very best. Share this with someone if you feel like they need some help. Bye, friends.